Hello everyone and welcome to this very special video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to make an After Effects plugin from beginning to end. This plugin is going to be a simple exposure plugin. When applied to any footage, it's going to allow us to change the exposure similar to how normal exposure effects work. Now this tutorial is going to be about everything, how to set up the environment to run and develop plugins on your system. We're going to be looking at the code and how we can actually program the nitty-gritty of a plugin. Before we get started, I just want to remind you down below, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it to be notified of when new videos are coming out. Definitely going to be releasing a lot more plugin videos coming up and quick tips to help you guys along. Also, all the code for this will be in the GitHub link in the description if you want to download and check it out for yourself. Down there you can also follow us on Instagram to be notified of when videos and tips go live. And it's also very relevant now that we have a plugin tutorial. We have a plugin section on our Discord. Make sure you head over and join us on Discord. Ask any questions you got here, as well as in the expressions, extensions, and scripting section. So let's get started, and if you guys want to skip through the video at any point, whether you're rewatching this or watching it for the first time, there will be timestamps where you can drag along the video to see what things you're learning at different times. So we're going to be learning how to write a plugin, what is required, and what do we need to learn. Although you don't really have to be a programmer, it's extremely recommended that you have experience with some kind of language and are fluent in that language, whether that's JavaScript, C, Java, Python. Pretty much any higher level language outside of like HTML or CSS should be enough of a foundation to at least get started. I would recommend that you understand how C or C++ works, at least in a minimal sense, so that you can understand what all these different highlighted syntactical things are, why you're getting errors when you're not casting values, and a lot of other things. Although in this tutorial I'll be going over a lot of the common issues you may have, it's also important to have that background in order to lessen your frustration. And speaking of being frustrated, prepare to be. You need to be ready to spend hours and hours working on the most annoying, menial things because you might be working on simple problems for long periods of times and complex problems for even longer. We're not just talking about simple problems that it tells you the error and you can Google your problem. We're talking about problems where you need to go in, make sure the values are all being converted correctly, check edge cases. It's a very complex process compared to, say, scripting or extensions, which is probably why I've tried and failed 2 times before this to learn plugins. Now let's go over the resources you'll need to write these plugins. On a Windows, you'll want to use Visual Studio, although I guess you might be able to use Visual Studio on Mac now. I'm not sure if there's a compatibility issue, but generally for Windows, you'll want to use Visual Studio. I have the community version, which you can get as well for free. If you're on a Mac, like I said, you might be able to use their Visual Studio version, but I personally use Xcode, which is basically the universal Mac programming application. The next thing you're going to need is the After Effects SDK. You can download this by just Googling After Effects SDK, which will take you to the sort of APIs, creative input output on Adobe's website. Just hit get the SDKs, and once you've logged in, it's going to take you to a list of all the applications in their SDKs, and this includes the scripting, extensions, and plugin SDK information that they have on any of these applications. So if I hit After Effects here, you can see they have the scripting, the plugin SDK, the CEP for panels and extensions, but we want the After Effects plugin SDK. You can download whichever one you want, but you'll want to make sure you download the version for your OS because it will include example files which will load in Visual Studio or Xcode. So in my case, I'll just download Windows and download the latest and agree, and it will essentially download a zip file with all of the example projects, documentation, header files, and include files you'll need. And the After Effects SDK is now your best friend. With this being the best documentation available and with the limited video resources we currently have, you're going to be spending a lot of time in here troubleshooting as well as looking at the example projects. I am using an older version, but you can use whichever one you want. Essentially, this guide is massive. It goes over everything from all the changes over the years of things they've added. Of course, there's an index to quickly navigate to things. There's a list of all of the included projects you downloaded in this zip file, and it will tell you what they do. So if you're looking for a certain feature or thing to learn, definitely check out this sample project description section. And then essentially it goes off to describe everything from all the flags, the effect world methods and functions, and including how to And it also has advanced things like creating plugins for other applications and the different types of plugins, which I'll probably go over in a different tutorial later. Now for the setup. You'll want to set up your SDK folder in a location in which everything sort of revolves around, because I have here basically made a plugins folder and learning, and it has my SDK folder extracted here, which has of course our SDK guide we've been looking at, and inside examples, which I have a shortcut to so I can quickly navigate to my examples, this is where all of the plugin files are located. I probably have a lot more folders here than you, but you should have some of the same ones, like headers, which has a lot of the header information, GP, and effect, and these contain all of our sample projects. So you want to have this in a common location on your computer which you can easily access, and essentially anytime we want to make a new project, we're going to reference this skeleton, and we're going to use this to duplicate the folder and then change the name from skeleton to whatever our project is. So in our case, we're going to basically be changing all the skeleton information to exposure information. And the way these are set up is from your examples folder, you want to have 2 folders down before you start seeing all these files. You have your C++, your header, and your other files 2 folder levels deeper. So for example, inside of, say here, I have multiple projects inside of one, and then the files are located in there. The reason you want to do this is because when you open up the projects, they have certain folder level references up to these important header files and other files it needs in order to make the SDK work properly. So basically from the examples folder, you want to go 2 folders down, and then you can have all of your files. Otherwise, your other stuff won't link with it. Now we're going to go ahead and get started with our skeleton project and changing everything and making it our own. So what I'm going to do is launch Visual Studio as an administrator, because oftentimes to connect it to the right things, it needs to be an administrator. And then I'm going to open up my examples, skeleton, and load up this project here. Now we're not actually going to start editing it right now. Right now we need to do an environment variable setup. So in order for Visual Studio to spit out our plugin file in the right location, we need to tell it where. So once we load our skeleton project, we're going to select the level of our skeleton right below the solution, so the project here, and then we're going to hit properties. Inside of properties contains a lot of the information that Visual Studio needs to reference our plugin SDK and other things. So what we're going to do is be setting up an environment variable called output directory, which is going to be referencing our After Effects plugin folder. On our actual computer, this is going to be in C, Program Files, Adobe, Common, Plugins 7.0, and Media Core. I have an NT Productions folder which exports all of the plugins into here, and we're basically going to be setting up a variable on our Windows only system where it exports it to here. So if you go on Windows to your computer and the System Properties, you'll want to go to Advanced System Properties, and then click on Environment Variables. Here we're going to want to create a new variable. Here you can see I already have mine, but I'm going to show you how to make a new one. So we're going to hit New under User Variables, and our variable name is going to be our AE plugin directory. So I'll paste that in there, and then our variable name is going to be the path to the folder where we want to save it out to. So again, in my case, that's in this folder here, so I can just copy and paste it and hit OK. Then you'll have this system variable which you can now output your plugins to. So once that's saved, go ahead and hit OK to save the changes and hit close. Now we're going to take our skeleton folder and copy and paste it or duplicate it. So you can see it's going to copy and paste about 200 megabytes of files, and I'm going to change the name to be exposure. So we're creating an exposure effect, and that's what we're going to call it. So we're going to go down and change the name again to exposure plugin, and now inside of here we have all of our files. I'm going to go ahead and run Visual Studio as an admin again, and now we're going to open up our exposure plugin skeleton files. So I'll open a project, and I'll go down into exposure and load the VCX project, which is a Visual Studio project. If you're on Mac, of course, there will be an Xcode project which you can load. Now you can see some of the stuff isn't loading properly, which is fine. What we're going to do is first click on our solution and hit F2, and F2 is to rename things. So I'm going to rename exposure and go down and rename everything exposure. But don't just overwrite all the text. Of course, make sure you don't, say in this case, make it just exposure. We want exposure strings. Basically, we're just wanting to replace skeleton with exposure in all of these file names we see here. Any of the header files, any of the C++ files that have skeleton, change it to exposure or whatever the name of it is. So now we have exposure, exposure, exposure. Let's go ahead and open up our exposure.cpp. Your exposure.cpp or your skeleton.cpp C++ is going to be your main running file. You can see we're going to have a bunch of errors in here already because it says linking to vignette.h, but we don't have a vignette. So what we're going to do is do a mass change. If I hit Control-Shift-H, we can replace in files. And if we look at our entire solution, we can replace the names of text in all the files contained within our plugin. So if we change vignette to exposure and make sure we match the case, we can replace it. So that fixed that error. Another thing I'm going to do is open my exposure.h, and you can see it's looking for skeleton strings. We don't have skeleton, we have exposure. And it's also has skeleton up here in caps. So I'm going to hit Control-Shift-H again and replace capital skeleton with capital exposure and hit replace all. I think that should be good for all of our replacing. Now we need to go over how this structure is working and what we need to modify in order to get things to work. But now that I'm actually looking at it, one cool thing is that we can almost already create this plugin and take a look at it. One thing I want to do under resources, we'll look at our R file. This contains what our match name, our display name, and other important information is going to be of our plugin. The main thing is we have our name here, which we'll call exposure tutorial. The category we'll put under NT Productions. And the match name, I'm going to change from Adobe Skeleton to Adobe Exposure Tutorial, or you can put whatever you want. So now I'm going to go ahead and right click on that and hit compile, which will basically compile it in some kind of binary code and make it ready. And then now I'm going to click on my project and hit properties again. Remember, we went here to set up our global output directory. Now I'm going to go under debugging and set my command target path. So what this is going to do is when we hit the play button to test this out, this is going to reference what's going to launch. We want to launch After Effects. So I'm going to browse to whatever version of After Effects I have, in my case CC 2018, and I can even select the shortcut. So I'll select the shortcut, and now the command that runs when we test this out is going to be After Effects. So we can quickly compile our plugin, launch After Effects, and test it out. So now if we've done everything correctly up to this point, let's go ahead and hit F5 and see if we get any errors or any problems. You can see we're getting an error that says cannot open file skeleton.h. Well, we don't have a skeleton file anymore, so good thing it told us this so we can change it to exposure, and now you can see it loads. Let's hit F5 again, or you can go up to build solution or hit local window. Oh yeah, and we also want to make sure After Effects is closed, so let's close that now that we've fixed that other error. And now we can go up to build the solution, or a quicker way to build and run is to hit F5 or this local Windows debugger. So hit play. You can see down here it tells me what's going on. It successfully created an After Effects plugin file called exposure. And now you can see it's going to load up this sort of link between After Effects. This is loading the application itself, what we just set up to launch the shortcut. So it launches After Effects for us. Now let's go ahead and create a comp and a layer real quick. And we'll go ahead and go down to NT Productions. And you can see we have Exposure Tutorial. Here is our plugin, and it's using the default values of what the skeleton used. So now what we're going to do is change the parameters that we view here and change some of the information, and then go down and basically adjust the pixels to apply the actual exposure effect. We're going to go over how to iterate over all the pixels in the image and change the exposure essentially. So now that we have our plugin actually working at this point, assuming you've done it correctly, we can now go on to adjust the properties and make the actual functionality. So we'll want to make sure we go back into Visual Studio and we can just hit stop. We want to make sure After Effects is closed, otherwise we'll get link errors and problems with that. Alright, let's go over the different file types that are going to be involved in plugins real quick. Firstly, we have the main CPP file. This is going to be a C++ file outside of all of these folders, and essentially what it is your main code. It contains what functions need to be run. It includes the first functions to be run. It includes your rendering, about your plugin, as well as the parameters that make up the UI, whether they're sliders, colors, checkboxes, etc. Sometimes they include string C++ files, which contain basically just string variables containing information about the plugin. So this one here contains a string just for the name of the plugin, which is skeleton. It contains the description, so when you hit about, it tells you about the plugin. It even contains the preset names for the sliders and other information in a separate file. So you can include these names in separate files to keep things really organized, or you can just include them in the main C++ file. So in my case, what we're going to do is just have an exposure slider. We don't need a color and a gain knob. So I'm going to get rid of this color and change gain to exposure, and I'll make sure the text says exposure. Now we're going to get an error. If we highlight over it, it says it's undefined. Well, this is because we also have header files. Header files contain other information that basically the C++ files refer to. So this includes exposure.header file. Let's see what's inside. Inside exposure.h, the header file, we have a bunch of definitions, which we don't have to worry about for now. It includes a bunch of effects and things that make plugins work in C++. So you can see we also have an exposure strings.h, which is actually associated with our exposure strings.c++. And the reason we're getting an issue in our exposure strings with our exposure name is because we just changed the name from gain to exposure. So if I go into my exposure strings, again, we can get rid of color, and we need to change gain to exposure. That's the variable name. And now if I go back into my exposure strings, now this is a valid variable. So inside of the strings C++ and strings H files, you're going to find information about basically the text that is contained in your plugin. Some plugins won't even include this, so it's up to you whether you want that level of organization or not. Now we need to quickly go over the exposure.header file, which contains different information. Aside from the top, which has a bunch of includes to include things that make plugins work with C++, if we scroll down, you can see we have some defaults, which I'll get rid of. It contains information for the versioning. This is very important, and you'll want to keep this basically the same for now. And then we have an important section where we define the structure of data that we're going to be using, as well as sort of the variables which are necessary to make those parameters work. If you remember, in this plugin when we loaded it, it had a gain slider and a color picker. That's represented by these two values here. We need to define everything before we create it in C++, essentially. So inside of this first enumeration, which basically is just setting these variables into the system, we need an input for whatever we're working on. This is the layer that we're applying things to. And trust me, these variables and enumerations might not make sense for quite a while. I'm still kind of getting the hang of them, but essentially in C++ we have to be very memory management specific, and we're defining all the things we're going to be dealing with here. So this is our exposure input, which is equal to 1 by default, which is our layer. We're going to be having a whole set of parameters, a variable called params. If we refer to the 0th index of params, it's going to give us the input layer itself. And then we need to have all of our other parameters, which are basically the inputs in our UI. Well, in our case, we don't have a gain and a color anymore. We just have an exposure, and then we need to have a comma, and then after everything there needs to be a num params. Basically we have our layer, all of the UI elements, and then on the outside we have the num params, which defines how many parameters we have. And then in the second enumeration, this is where we define the disk IDs. The disk ID is basically another variable to keep track of the parameters in the visual portion of the plugin. So we only need one in this case, and that's going to be exposure.disk ID. I'm just using the general name conventions already used in these plugins, which is perfectly fine. So just to reiterate, for the first enumeration in your header file, you need an input as the first value, no matter what. At the end, you need num params, no matter what. All of your UI elements go in between. Basically, if this first enumeration -2 does not equal this amount, then it's not going to work. These need to be set up in a very specific way so C++ and the plugin knows all the values going to be used. So again, we just have this starting at 0 as our layer, all of the UI elements, and as we create more complex plugins, you'll see how that changes, and then the number of params, and then this needs to be equal to 1 as the first value because it goes from 0, 1, 2, etc. So hopefully that makes sense. If you guys have any questions at any point, of course, just leave a comment or ask in the Discord. Then lastly, in our header file, we have our data variable. Currently it's set to gain. Let's change it to exposure. And if you're not familiar with C++, this is creating a new data type. It's called a gain info in this case, which I'll change to like exposure info. And what this is doing is defining a structure, which we basically could fill with as many variables as we want. We could have a transfer mode index. There's so many different types of things we could store inside of here, but for now we just have an exposure slider. So with this structure called exposure info, we're basically going to have a variable storing our exposure. And this data type pflong underscore fplong is a type of long variable containing lots of information specific to After Effects and Premiere SDK. As you go along and learn more about plugins, there are many different data types, and it's sometimes very strict about what kind we use. So those are the main files we need to deal with before getting into the nitty-gritty now of our plugin. We've gone over the strings files that are header files and the C++ file, as well as our main exposure header file here, or whatever your project may be called. Now we can dive in to the exposure.c++. First, I'm going to go over how everything is run in what order here, and then we're going to go in and create our first function to adjust the exposure. So if you just look around, the first thing you're going to see is the about. This is important, and it contains basically all of those version name, the major and the minor versions, as well as the name and description of our plugin, which were contained inside of this file here. Next up is the global setup, where it again references our major, minor, and other versions, as well as sets flags up for our plugin. Flags we'll be discussing later, which basically can detect things like whether you're using 32 or 16-bit color and a bunch of other useful things. Then we have params set up. This is where we set up the visual aspect of our plugin. So looking at that, we have an error here. It's trying to use exposure gain min, exposure gain max, exposure gain min, exposure gain max, and exposure gain default. These were things that were defined in the header file that I just deleted. So instead we can put in whatever value we want. Let's say for the min 0.001. For the max, let's say 3.000. We want quite a bit of precision here. And then for the default, we'll just say 1.000. And this precision is called precision hundredths, but it's actually the thousandths place. So I'm going to say thousandths, and that will define how specific and detailed that slider gets. You can say integer, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, whatever you want. And then we need to basically give it our disk ID that references our exposure here. So exposure disk ID. And now that should remove the errors, I believe. We need to actually change this to exposure param name, and now we have that, and we can delete the element below it. A quick note on the param setup: you can basically get a full list of everything in the SDK by typing in add underscore, and we can add a param, and these are all the params you can add: colors, sliders, checkbox, buttons, angles, and play around with all of those elements yourself. You can basically add them, and if you hover over the add, you can see all the things it requires. A name, it requires a name, a minimum, a maximum, a slider min, a slider max, a default value, precision like the hundredths, and a bunch of other values. And sliders are more complicated, other things are a lot simpler to figure out. And lastly, in your param setup, before you define any UI element, you need to clear the structure. So we have a param def here, and we're clearing the structure of it, which basically means we're setting it up to be populated. So anytime you call a new UI element, just copy and paste this right before you define it. So if I created another slider, I would clear the structure of our def, our param def, and then I would create my next slider. If I tried to run this now, it should not work because I still have a couple of errors. I changed gain info to exposure info, so I can do another mass change here and say gain info is equal to exposure info and replace all. And that should fix a few things. Another thing you can see, this is referring to our gain F. Again, this is exposure now. And I'm actually going to delete this 16 function because we're just going to deal with 8-bit for now. And I'm going to again change this to exposure. If I keep scrolling, I'm going to keep finding problems. Under render, basically it's going to give us gain again. It needs to be exposure. And here's the params I was referring to. If we go back to our header, we need to reference our exposure slider exposure param. So I'll just paste in that. And then I'm going to remove this code that says world is deep. So we just have this one function right here. It's saying that this needs to be type pf underscore fp short. So now we need to cast these values. So I'll say pf underscore fp short and cast that to our values here. The reason we need to cast these is sometimes it's very specific about what format you use. So if it says that you need to use a certain format, just type in the format and surround it in parentheses. Now if I run it, just getting a minor issue here, and retry it. And now if I go ahead and load up a layer here and go and apply my effects, exposure tutorial, now we still have everything working and nothing has really changed, but we can actually change this and see a slight change from the previous code. But if we hit about, you can see it says exposure and all of that string information is over in this area here. So now essentially it's writing our plugin to that folder. The last thing we need to do is look at how we can create our own custom pixel manipulation function. One thing to note is if you scroll all the way down to effect main, this is the sort of main guts to first launch of your plugin. It's going to send in a bunch of different commands to effect main. It can send in the about function when you hit the about button and then it loads about. It can send the global setup to set up all the versioning and all that, but the main thing is it can send render, and render is one of many types of rendering that it can send here. There's also smart rendering, which we'll discuss later, but render is going to be where everything's rendered pixel wise. So if I go into my render function here, you can see based on the skeleton we have a couple things set up here. The first thing is we're setting up our structure to store our exposure data based on our plugin inputs, so we can store whatever number this is set to. And then we basically set our GIP variable here, which we can call whatever we want. Before it was called the gain basically pointer. You could change it to whatever you want. But essentially we're going to store our exposure value. Remember in our header file, we have this special object with the exposure type here. And this is where we're going to store the actual value of the slider. So we're going to set the value of that equal to our parameters, and our parameters store again all of this information here. So we could also reference here to get our layer if we reference parameter index 0, and we're going to get parameter called exposure, and we're going to grab the UI element for that, and FSD means the slider, and we're going to get the value. A lot of it is learning by experience, but I have this little list here with all of the types here. U refers to the UI basically, and then each type of UI element, in this case, if we look at fs_d, it's a float slider. So that's how we get the value of the float slider, and then dot value. Then we're going to use the iterate sweep function, which iterates over all the pixels in the image, every single pixel. It's going to apply this function to it. So we're using the iterate 8 because we're in 8 bits per channel, and we're going to take basically our exposure input layer, which is this. This is how we reference the layer it's applied to. Params, our exposure input, the user, the U, and then the layer definition. And we're going to run my simple gain function 8. We're going to change this to exposure 8. Then we're going to run up here to my simple gain function 8 and call it exposure 8. This is the last bit of code before our plugin is ready. Okay, all we need to do is go ahead and clear this, and we have our exposure info here, and we're going to check if our exposure info is valid. If there's information inside of this object we've created, we're going to run some code. The way we refer to this code is essentially by saying, and I have a value here, I'm just going to set to exposure amounts, fp long is equal to 0. I'm going to set the exposure amounts equal to our exposure value. And honestly, I don't think I need a separate variable for this. Let's just take gip.exposure. And all we have to do to manipulate pixels is refer to inp or outp. Inp refers to the incoming layer pixel. So if we're looking at a pure white pixel, it's going to give us an NP object. If we look at the NP alpha, it's going to be whatever the alpha value is. If we look at the NP red value, it's going to be maxed out at 255. So what we can do is multiply the input value by our exposure to increase or decrease its value. You can see right here they're setting the output alpha to whatever the input alpha is, which is fine. Keep the alpha the same. But we're going to set the output red and the output green and the output blue to something different. We're using this instead of dot because these are pointers to the pixel itself. We're modifying the actual pixels here. So what we're going to do, we're going to make the output red equal to our input red, so np.red, times our exposure value. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the green, multiply it by our exposure, and for our np. And then for our output blue, we're going to set that equal to our input blue times the exposure. So if we hit F5 to try and run this, you can see we're going to get an error. The first thing is I need to make this full name exposure. If I try and run it again, you can see conversion from FP long to AU char, possible loss of data. This is another case where I need to cast this, which basically means, again, convert to this type, because C++ is very specific about what types. So we're going to cast this whole calculation as an AU char and surround it in parentheses. And now if we hit run, it's going to successfully compile our plugin. Let's run it and see if it's working. And now I'm going to go ahead and load in some normal footage here. And if I apply my effects exposure tutorial, let's go ahead and change the value. You can see as we increase it, the exposure goes up, and as we decrease it, the exposure goes down. You can see we're getting some weird bleeding if we move in here to pure red, pure yellow, and pure other values. We can fix this by basically clamping the values if they reach above 255 pixels, keep them at 255. But that's basically how we can create a simple plugin for After Effects. You can mess around with this exposure plugin, add your own clamp to make sure those values don't get out of hand, increase the intensity of the exposure, and really use these values here to start messing around with how to deal with individual pixels, how to start manipulating things. And as I release more tutorials, I'll explain how there's different layers to all this. Not only can we manipulate pixels, we can store these manipulations into their own layers, composite these layers, and it goes on and on and on. That's going to do it for this plugin video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, hit the thumbs up button, hit subscribe down below, and hit the bell icon to be notified of new videos coming out twice weekly on the channel. Plenty of plugin videos coming. If you want to use this code for yourself and start modifying and learning yourself, make sure to check out the description. All the links down there will be for the resources as well as the GitHub link for the code itself. You can also follow us down there on Instagram to be notified of new videos and other live updates. Of course, go check out the Discord. Hopefully you guys will start talking a bit more about plugins with questions, and we can start getting the community to create plugins together. Also check it out to join the scripting, extensions, and expressions discussion. And that's going to do it for this video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.